The taser was already drawn when the screaming started. Three security guards stood frozen outside ICU Bay 7, radios crackling, nobody moving. Inside, a 220-pound Special Forces veteran was tearing the IV lines from his arms and screaming in a language that wasn't English, wasn't Arabic, wasn't anything the charge nurse had ever heard. A trauma cart lay overturned. A monitor was shattered. Two orderlies had already retreated down the hallway with split lips and shaking hands, and the attending physician was on his phone, demanding sedation authorization while standing 15 feet from the door he refused to enter. Nobody went in. Then Claire Donovan walked past all of them, pushed the door open with her shoulder, and disappeared inside. Harwick Memorial Hospital sat on the eastern edge of Caldwell, Oregon, close enough to the Columbia River that fog rolled through the parking structure on winter mornings and turned the whole building gray before sunrise. It was not a prestigious institution. It did not attract research grants or visiting professors or the kind of residents who had their choice of placement. It attracted people who needed a job and couldn't be particular about which job it was, and it attracted patients from the logging camps and the freight depots and the VA referral pipeline that sent veterans to wherever had an open bed. Claire had transferred in 11 days ago. She was 34 years old, 5'6", with a short ponytail that was always slightly uneven because she cut it herself in the break room mirror when it got long enough to bother her. She had a nursing license from the state of Oregon, a letter of reference from a hospital in Medford she'd left without much explanation, and a personnel file thin enough that the HR coordinator had held it up to the light looking for pages she might have missed. What the file did not contain: any record of the 8 years Claire Donovan had spent before nursing school. She had been careful about that. The ICU charge nurse, a 51-year-old career veteran named Rosalind Marsh, had pulled Claire aside on her second day and explained the situation in the flat, practiced tone of someone who had delivered the same speech before and expected it to land the same way. The patient in Bay 7 is Sergeant First Class Marcus Webb, 41. Combat sniper, 3 deployments, 2 in places that don't appear on any official record. He was brought in from a VA transfer with sepsis and what the intake form calls acute stress response, which is the polite version of saying he tried to put a corpsman through a wall. We have standing orders for chemical sedation if he becomes agitated. He becomes agitated approximately every 6 hours. Do not engage him without backup. Do not enter that room alone. Do not attempt conversation. The man is not in contact with reality right now, and the last nurse who thought she could reason with him went home with 3 cracked ribs. What does he respond to? Claire asked. Rosalind looked at her the way people look at someone who has asked a question so far outside the expected range that they need a moment to reorient. He doesn't. That's the point. He must respond to something: breathing cues, positional pressure, auditory input. Claire. Rosalind set down the clipboard she'd been holding. He's scheduled for medically induced coma pending psych consult. Dr. Alderman wants him under by Thursday. Until then, minimal contact, maximum distance, and if he escalates, you call security before you do anything else. Are we clear? Claire said yes. She said it in the tone that people usually accepted as agreement. It was not agreement. She had spent the next 9 days reading his chart between patient rounds, pulling every notation, every vitals entry, every nursing observation logged since his arrival. She read the transfer summary from the VA twice and the surgical notes 3 times. She noted that his fever spikes followed a pattern, worse in the evenings, correlating with a drop in ambient noise, which meant his nervous system was interpreting quiet as a threat. She noted that his worst episodes had all occurred between the hours of 9 p.m. and 2 a.m. She noted that nobody had documented whether he'd had any response to voice contact because nobody had tried voice contact without immediately retreating when he raised his volume. She said nothing about her observations to Rosalind. She said nothing about them to Dr. Alderman, who was a hospitalist with a genuine talent for paperwork and a genuine blind spot for anything that couldn't be addressed with a prescription. She said nothing to the float nurse, Kevin, who had taken to leaving a coffee cup outside Bay 7 as a kind of memorial to the concept of due diligence. On the 11th night, the screaming started at 11:47 p.m. Claire was at the nursing station charting vitals when the sound hit the hallway. She put down her pen without hurrying, stood up, and walked toward Bay 7 at the same pace she walked everywhere. Deliberate, unhurried, like she had already calculated every step and found the calculation satisfactory. The 3 security guards were already there. One had a taser out. Another was on his radio. The third was doing the specific kind of nothing that people do when they're waiting for someone else to make the first move. Rosalind appeared from around the corner, saw Claire heading for the door, and grabbed her by the arm. "Don't. I'm going in." "You are not going in alone. That is a direct, I know what it is." Claire gently removed Rosalind's hand from her arm. Not roughly, not dismissively. With the particular care of someone who has had to remove people's hands from her body before, in circumstances where gentleness was the only remaining tool. "Give me 3 minutes. He will hurt you." "He might." She pushed the door open. The room was wrecked. The overturned cart was real, the monitor shattered, the IV pole horizontal, a chair on its side in the corner. Marcus Webb was standing against the far wall with his back pressed to it, which was tactically sound if you were being overrun and needed to protect your flank, which his nervous system currently believed he was. He was shirtless, sweating through the surgical site on his left shoulder, and he was screaming in a continuous stream that Claire now recognized as fragments from 3 different languages running together: English, Pashto, and something she identified after 2 seconds as a regional dialect she'd encountered once in a classified briefing room in a building that no longer officially existed. She did not run. She walked to the center of the room and stood still. He didn't stop screaming, but his eyes found her. She waited. She let him look. She let the volume stay high without flinching from it, without backing up, without reaching for anything. She had learned a long time ago that the fastest way to de-escalate a person operating on pure threat response was to remove every cue that confirmed the threat. Movement was a cue. Retreat was a cue. The body language of fear was a cue, and he could read it the way she'd been trained to read satellite imagery, in fragments, in patterns, in information that bypassed conscious processing entirely. She stood still. After 43 seconds, she counted. The screaming dropped. Not stopped. Dropped. A roar to something that was almost language. She took 1 step toward him, slow, deliberate. She kept her hands visible at her sides, and she held his gaze with the particular kind of directness that wasn't aggression, wasn't challenge, was just presence. The acknowledgement of another human being at full attention. "I hear you," she said, quietly. In English first. He stared at her. Then she said 5 words. Not English. The sound of them was precise, particular, with a cadence that had been formalized in a context most people in that hallway had never come close to and never would. A verbal authentication sequence used in classified field communications. The kind that told an operative that the person speaking it had clearance, had context, was not the enemy. She said it once. Marcus Webb stopped moving entirely. Outside the room, through the small window in the door, Rosalind Marsh was watching. So were the 3 security guards. So was Kevin, who had come around the corner when the screaming started and had stayed because he couldn't process what he was seeing. Inside, the silence was so complete that they could hear the monitoring equipment in the next bay. Webb's chest was still heaving. His hands were still fisted at his sides. But his eyes had changed. The glassed-over war-decade look had shifted into something that was trying very hard to be present. "You..." His voice cracked. He swallowed. "Who are you?" "My name is Claire. I'm your nurse tonight." He stared at her for a long moment. Then he looked down at his hands like he wasn't sure they belonged to him. Then back at her. "Where did you..." He stopped, started again. "Where did you learn that?" "Sit down," she said. "I'll get your line restarted, and then we can talk." He didn't sit immediately. He looked at the overturned furniture, the shattered monitor, with something that was coming through as shame. The particular exhausted shame of a person who has lost control of themselves in a way they cannot explain and cannot stop and cannot account for, and who has hurt people in the process. He sat down on the edge of the bed. Claire pulled the IV pole upright and started looking through the supply tray for what she needed. Outside the door, nobody moved for a long time. Dr. Raymond Alderman found out about the incident at 7:15 the following morning when Rosalind filed her shift report, and he read the section marked ICU Bay 7, Patient Incident, and then read it again because it didn't parse correctly the first time. He came to the nursing station with his tablet in one hand and a look on his face that Claire recognized as the specific expression of a person who feels authority slipping and is compensating with volume. "You entered Bay 7 alone." "Yes." against standing protocol. The protocol was inadequate for the situation. He set the tablet on the counter with a sound just short of a slam. Let me explain something to you because you've been here 11 days and you apparently haven't absorbed the basic. The patient's fever was 103.4 when I took it at midnight. I've adjusted his antibiotic timing based on the sepsis management protocol and flagged it in the chart. His pain level was a 9 when I asked him to rate it. It's a 5 now. He slept from 1:30 to 6 and without incident. I documented all of it. She paused. Would you like to review the chart? Alderman looked at the tablet, then at her. There was a long moment in which Claire understood perfectly that what was happening was not a conversation about medical care. It was a conversation about who was in charge, and the fact that the chart was correct was almost beside the point. You are a transfer nurse on a 90-day provisional contract, he said. You do not modify treatment timelines without physician sign-off. You do not enter a potentially violent patient's room without security present. And you do not make decisions that override standing orders because you have decided, in your personal judgment, that those orders are inadequate. He picked the tablet back up. I'm noting this in your provisional review. 2 more incidents and we initiate a termination process. Are we clear? Completely, Claire said. She went back to charting. By the end of the day, 3 of the other floor nurses had heard the story. By the following morning, 2 attending physicians had weighed in, neither of them aldermen, and both of them with opinions that were less charitable than his, because aldermen at least acknowledged the chart was accurate. The consensus, delivered in the particular shorthand of hospital politics, was that Claire Donovan was a problem. She was a new hire who didn't know her place, had no background anyone could account for, and had gotten lucky with a volatile patient in a way that could easily have ended badly, and if they let it go unremarked, they'd be setting a precedent that made everyone's lives harder. She heard most of it. She heard some of it directly, and some of it in the half-silences that opened up when she walked into a room and closed again when she walked out. She was not unfamiliar with the phenomenon. What she was watching, more carefully than anyone realized, was Bay 7. Marcus Webb was recovering. Slowly, not cleanly. Sepsis didn't resolve cleanly, and the wound on his shoulder was deeper than the initial assessment had noted, and the stress response was going to take longer than any timeline the psych consult had proposed. But he was coherent for longer stretches now. He was eating. He had twice asked for a specific podcast about long-distance shooting that he listened to with headphones while staring at the ceiling, and Claire had found it for him without comment. On the 4th day after the incident, he was awake when she came in for morning vitals, and he was looking at her in a way he hadn't before. Not the dissociated combat response look. Not the shame of the night everything came apart, but something considered, something that was working through a question. You were comms, he said. It was not a question. Claire wrapped the blood pressure cuff around his arm and pressed the button on the monitor. Your pressure's down from yesterday. That's good. Don't do that. His voice was level. He was not agitated, the opposite. He was the most still she'd seen him. I've been trying to place you since Tuesday. You weren't field, but you knew that authentication. You knew the dialect. Comms officer, probably intel adjacent, given the fluency. He paused. You were on the Korengal rotation, 2017 to 2018. The cuff inflated. The monitor beeped. 118 over 76, Claire said. Your fever's been under 100 for 14 hours. I'm optimistic we're through the worst of the sepsis phase. She pulled the cuff off and made a note in the chart tablet. Claire. He waited until she looked at him. I'm not going to push, but I need you to know that I know. Whatever you're doing here, and I'm getting the sense it's not just nursing, I know. She held his gaze. She held it long enough that it was its own kind of answer. Get some rest, she said. I'll be back at noon. She was 2 steps from the door when he said quietly, Bravo Element, August 2018. We lost 4 men in an ambush that happened about 30 minutes after a comm update rerouted our approach. She stopped. I used to think it was bad intel, he said. Now I'm wondering if it was something else. She stood with her hand on the door. She didn't turn around. Rest, she said again. And she left. The conversation with Alderman happened 3 days later, and it was worse than the first one. He had called her into his office, a glass-walled room off the main corridor that gave him visibility in all directions, which Claire noted was either unconscious or a deliberate assertion of control, and she'd stopped assuming things were unconscious years ago. With him were Rosalind Marsh, the department head for nursing services, and a woman from HR whose name was printed on a lanyard she kept touching in a way that suggested she was new to uncomfortable conversations. "There's been a second incident," Alderman said. He opened a folder on his desk without looking at it. "Last night, 12:40 a.m. You spent 40 minutes in Bay 7 outside your standard round schedule. No security present, no documentation filed until this morning. I filed it first thing this shift. That's not the point. The patient was in distress. I stabilized him. He's being scheduled for chemical sedation. We made this decision collectively with the psych consult, and it was communicated to nursing staff. Your continued intervention is, he doesn't need sedation." Claire said it without heat, without volume, without anything that could be characterized as insubordination except the content of the words. "His episodes are trauma response cycles with a predictable physiological trigger. Sedation will mask the symptom and do nothing for the underlying." "Claire." Rosalind's voice was not unkind. It was the voice of a person trying to do two things at once: execute a directive she had been given and maintain something that resembled humanity about it. "We understand you feel strongly, but the protocol exists for patient and staff safety. You're not in a position to override it." "I'm not overriding anything. I'm flagging a clinical concern through the appropriate channel, which is this conversation." "Which we're logging," said the HR woman, touching her lanyard. "Good, log it." Claire looked at Alderman. "If you sedate him now, he'll be in a chemically induced coma by the time the federal request comes in." Silence. Alderman's expression didn't change, but something behind it shifted. "What federal request?" "I don't know exactly, but I know that a decorated combat veteran who was part of a classified special operations unit doesn't stay in a county hospital on a standard VA referral without someone eventually noticing. And when they do notice, and when they send someone to ask questions, it's going to matter very much whether he's conscious and coherent or whether he's been sedated into a vegetative state because nobody wanted to manage his care differently." She paused. "That's the clinical concern I'm flagging." The room was very quiet. "Your provisional contract," Alderman said carefully, "is under review as of this morning. I'd strongly recommend you focus on your assigned patients and leave Sergeant Webb's care to the team managing his case." "Of course," Claire said. She left the office. In the hallway, she passed Kevin, who had clearly been hovering close enough to catch the volume, if not the content, and who looked at her with the expression of someone watching a person walk calmly off a cliff. "You good?" he said. "Fine." She kept walking. What she didn't say, to Kevin or to anyone, she had spent the previous night not just in Marcus Webb's room but at the workstation outside it, running a cross-reference that she had no official authorization to run. It had taken her 6 hours, and the careful, unhurried exploitation of a database access level that should have been deactivated when she left a position that also didn't appear in her file. What she had found was a medication order. The order was for a drug combination that, individually, were both appropriate to Webb's care. Together, given his specific weight, his compromised liver function from the sepsis, and the timing of his antibiotic cycle, they would produce a cascade that any forensic pharmacologist would eventually identify as intentional, but that in the immediate aftermath would look entirely like a complication of his existing condition. The order had been placed through a physician login. The physician whose login was used had been off-site for 3 days. Someone had accessed that login remotely. Someone had known enough about Marcus Webb's chart to calculate a dose that would work. Someone in, or with access to, Harwick Memorial Hospital wanted him dead, and had spent enough time with his medical records to know exactly how to do it quietly. Claire went back to the nursing station and sat down at the charting terminal. She pulled up the medication order. She flagged it for pharmacist review on grounds of dosing conflict identified, and attached a 2-page clinical notation that would take the pharmacy team the better part of a day to process. Then she opened a secure messaging application on her personal phone. Not the hospital network, not anything that went through a server she didn't control. And she typed a message of 43 words. She sent it to a contact listed in her phone as a series of numbers, no name. Then she put the phone away, picked up a pen, and went back to charting. Around her, the night shift moved through its ordinary rhythms, the beeping monitors, the distant PA, the squeak of sneakers on linoleum, the low murmur of a hospital at work. At 3:14 a.m., a pharmacy alert flagged the medication order as suspended pending review. At 3:16 a.m., someone using a terminal registered to a consulting physician on the hospital's external access portal attempted to override the suspension. The override failed. At 3:17 a.m., the access attempt triggered a security log that Claire had already set to export to an external server the moment it appeared. She was still at the nursing station. She looked at the notification on her phone, set it face down on the desk, and went to check on the patient in Bay 4 who had been complaining of nausea since midnight. She was very calm. She was also aware, in the specific, practiced way of someone who had operated in threat environments before, that the situation had crossed a threshold in the last 11 minutes. The person who had placed that order knew it had been blocked. They would be deciding now what to do next. They would be running the same kind of calculation she would run. What are the remaining options? What is the cost of each one? And how much time is there before the situation becomes unrecoverable? She knew that calculation. She had run it before, in places a lot less well lit than this. She checked on the patient in Bay 4, adjusted his positioning, updated his chart, and returned to the station. Then she went to Bay 7, quietly, without checking whether anyone was watching. Marcus Webb was asleep, but lightly, the particular lightness of a person whose nervous system has learned to stay close to the surface. He woke when she came in, the way soldiers wake, completely and immediately. "I need you to listen to me," she said. She kept her voice low and her body between him and the door, not because she was protecting him from the door, but because it was the position that let her see through the window into the hallway. "And I need you to trust that what I'm about to say is true, even though I can't explain all of it right now." He looked at her. He was fully awake. He was reading her body language the way she'd been reading his, and what he was reading was, she is not panicked, but she is serious in a way she has not been serious before. "Tell me," he said. "There is a medication order in your chart that was placed by someone who should not have access to your chart. It has been blocked for now. But blocked doesn't mean stopped." She paused. "You're not safe here." He didn't ask her how she knew. He didn't ask her who. He looked at the IV line in his arm, at the monitoring leads on his chest, at the window in the door. "When?" he said. "I don't know yet. I'm working on it." "What do you need from me?" "Right now? Nothing. Stay calm. Let me manage this." She met his eyes. "I've done this before." "I know you have," he said quietly. She straightened up. She adjusted his blanket because that was the thing a nurse would be doing in his room at 3:20 in the morning, and because the small practiced gestures of ordinary care were their own kind of anchor when everything else was moving. She was almost at the door when she heard the sound, quiet, almost nothing, the particular sound of a fire door at the end of the hall not quite catching when it opened. She looked through the window. The hallway was empty, but the fire door at the east end was moving, barely, just a tremor of the hydraulic closer doing its work. And there was no reason for anyone to use that door at this hour, and the security desk was on the west end of the floor, and the nurse who should have been at the station had gone to the break room 8 minutes ago. Claire stood very still. Someone was on the floor. She did not move toward the fire door, moving toward an unknown contact in a confined corridor with no backup, and one exit was the kind of decision that looked bold and ended badly, and Claire had spent enough time in situations that required actual boldness to know the difference between courage and stupidity. She stayed where she was, inside Bay 7, with the door cracked 2 inches and her hand flat against the frame, and she watched. The hallway was still empty. The fire door had stopped moving. The hydraulic closer had done its work, and the door was flush with the frame now, showing nothing, giving nothing away. But she had heard it. She was certain of that. Behind her, Marcus Webb had pushed himself upright on the bed without making a sound. He had pulled the monitoring leads off his chest in the specific sequence that muted the telemetry alarm rather than triggering it, which told her everything she needed to know about his current functional state. He was operating on instinct and training, not on pain or confusion. The sepsis had knocked him down significantly, but had not knocked him out, and whatever had come back to him in the last 4 days had included the part of his nervous system that responded to threat by becoming very quiet and very efficient. "How many exits on this floor?" he said. Low. Almost no volume. 4. East fire door, west stairwell, main elevator bank, and a service corridor through laundry that comes out on the ground level. "You've already mapped it." "Yes." He looked at her. There was no surprise in it. "How long have you known someone was coming?" I flagged the medication order tonight. Whoever placed it knows it was blocked. That gave them, she glanced at her watch, about 40 minutes to decide their next move. And you waited 40 minutes to tell me. I was making sure first. He didn't argue with that. She registered it, the absence of argument, the immediate recalibration, and filed it next to everything else she had been filing about him since the first night. Can you walk? She said. He was already swinging his legs off the bed. She watched him test his weight and saw the shoulder compensate, the lean to the right, the brief pause at the first moment of full pressure on both feet. He was not steady. He was not anywhere close to the physical capacity he'd had before the ambush that had put him in a VA transfer pipeline 2 months ago. But he was upright, and he was coherent, and he was moving with the practiced economy of someone who had learned a long time ago to function in a degraded state. Well enough, he said. She pulled his IV line and covered the site with a pressure bandage from the supply tray in 6 seconds. She grabbed the secondary monitoring lead and disconnected it properly, making sure the nurse station would read it as a technical fault rather than a flat line. Then she picked up the clothing bag from the lower shelf of his bedside cabinet. She'd put it there 2 days ago, quietly, during a routine room check, and she handed it to him. He looked at the bag, at her, at the bag again. 2 days ago, she said. I know. He pulled the bag open without further comment and started dressing. Claire cracked the door again and checked the hallway. Still empty. The nursing station at the west end of the floor was visible in the distance, and she could see the monitor banks, and all of them read normal, which meant whoever had come through that fire door had not moved toward the station, had not triggered any of the floor sensors, and was either very good at moving in hospitals or was waiting. She did not like waiting as a tactical choice. Waiting meant patience, which meant planning, which meant the person behind the fire door had done this before. She pulled her phone out and sent a second message to the number contact. 8 words this time. Then she pocketed the phone and looked back at Webb, who had his shirt on and was working the buttons with his right hand because his left shoulder wasn't cooperating, and he was doing it fast enough that she didn't offer to help, and she respected that. There's a service corridor through the supply room at the end of this hall, she said. Takes us through laundry, out through the loading dock to the ground-level parking structure. My car is on level 2. You parked for an exit. I park for exits everywhere. He got the last button. Where are we going? Somewhere I can explain the rest without being interrupted. She paused. And somewhere your chart can't follow you. They moved through the supply room at 3:31 a.m., with no lights, no conversation, and the particular speed of 2 people who have decided the situation has moved past the point where hesitation is useful. Claire knew the layout because she had walked it on her 3rd day, the way she walked every floor she worked, systematically, without apparent purpose, building a map she could access without thinking when she needed it. The laundry corridor smelled of industrial detergent and warm linen and the specific damp heat of machines that ran continuously, and the noise covered their movement, which was something. The loading dock was cold, the parking structure was colder, and the concrete amplified every sound, and Webb was favoring his left side more noticeably now that he was moving through open space instead of a confined room. Stop a second, she said. I'm fine. I know. Stop anyway. He stopped. She put 2 fingers against the surgical site through his shirt and pressed, gently, assessing. He made a sound, but held still. You've pulled something, not catastrophic, but you need to not use the left arm more than necessary for the next few hours. Noted. He started moving again. Her car was a 10-year-old Subaru that she had bought secondhand in Medford and had never gotten around to replacing because it started reliably, and she didn't spend enough time in any one place to care about the aesthetics. She got in, started it, pulled out of the space, and was on the exit ramp before she heard the sound. Tires on concrete, somewhere below them, moving fast. She turned right instead of left at the ramp exit, which took them away from the main road and into the freight access route behind the hospital. And she drove at exactly the speed limit because driving faster than the speed limit on an empty road at 3:30 in the morning was how you got noticed. In the passenger seat, Webb was watching the mirrors. One vehicle, he said. Dark sedan. Turned off its lights. I see it. We're being followed from the hospital. Yes. Which means whoever is in that car was inside the building, or waiting outside it with enough information to know where we'd come out. She turned again, this time onto a commercial street with a 24-hour truck depot on one side and a closed hardware store on the other, because the truck depot had 3 separate ingress and egress points, and a parking area large enough that a single pursuing vehicle would have to commit to a lane before knowing which way she was going. She went through the depot access road without stopping and came out the far side and turned immediately onto the highway on-ramp heading east. The sedan did not follow through the depot. She drove for 11 minutes without speaking. Webb watched the mirrors and said nothing. The highway was quiet. The fog from the river had thinned by now, and the headlights reached farther than they had an hour ago, and there was nothing behind them. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he agreed. She had rented a storage unit in a town called Draper Falls, 40 minutes east of Caldwell, 8 months before she applied for the nursing position at Harwick Memorial. The unit was registered under a name that was not Claire Donovan, paid in cash on a rotating basis, and contained 2 waterproof cases, a charging station for 3 separate communication devices, and a folding cot she had added 3 weeks ago when it became clear that she might need it. She had also left a first aid kit comprehensive enough to manage minor surgical complications, which was a category that now applied directly to the man sitting on the cot, watching her open the smaller of the 2 waterproof cases. "You want to tell me how long you've been planning this?" he said. "Planning is a strong word. Preparing." "For what?" She opened the case and started the first communication device. For the possibility that the medication order wasn't a one-time event, that whoever placed it had been monitoring your care since before you arrived at Harwick. He was quiet for a moment. She could hear him processing it. "That's a long preparation window for a nurse who transferred in 11 days ago." "I transferred in 11 days ago." She looked up at him. "I started preparing 8 months ago." The device finished its boot sequence. She picked it up and typed in a 14-character access code from memory, and the screen populated with a thread of messages that had been waiting. "Talk to me," Webb said. Not a demand. Something more careful than that. The voice of a person who has been operating without context for long enough that the context has started to feel dangerous. So she talked. She did not make it smooth or sequential. She had not rehearsed it, and the unrehearsed version was patchy and nonlinear and had gaps she couldn't fill without clearances she no longer technically held, and she was aware that the version she was telling him was going to raise more questions than it answered. But it was true, which was the only thing that mattered right now. In 2017, she had been a military intelligence communications officer attached to a forward operating base in a province that did not appear in any public record. Her role had been to manage secure communications between field teams and command, which in practice meant she was the person who transmitted route updates, intel corrections, and operational changes to units in the field. She was good at the work. She was fast, she was accurate, and she had a specific aptitude for reading the secondary content of encrypted transmissions, the things people said in the spaces between what they officially reported. In August of 2018, she had transmitted a route update to a special operations element in the field. The update had come through the standard command channel with standard authentication, and there had been no reason to question it. She had sent it. 30 minutes later, that element had walked into an ambush that killed 4 men and left the surviving team members scattered across 2 kilometers of hostile terrain. Marcus Webb had been one of the survivors. She had not known that at the time. She had spent the following 3 months in the kind of institutional limbo that happens after a catastrophic operational failure. Debriefings, reviews, questions she answered and questions that were never asked, reports filed and reports that disappeared. She had been cleared of wrongdoing. The route update had been authenticated. The failure had been attributed to compromised local intelligence networks. She had believed that for almost 4 years. "What changed?" Webb said. "I met someone." She kept her voice level. "A signals analyst who had been running a retrospective on communication intercepts from that region. He found something in the metadata of the transmission I sent. The route update, the one I authenticated and transmitted, had been injected into the command channel from an external source. It wasn't bad intel. It was a fabricated order. Someone with access to the authentication protocols had inserted it into the system and used my transmission to deliver it." Webb was very still. "Meaning the ambush was engineered," he said. "Yes. By someone inside the command structure. By someone with access to the command structure. That's not necessarily the same thing." He stood up. The cot shifted. He walked 3 steps to the far wall of the storage unit and stood there with his back to her for a moment, and she let him have that because she understood what it was. It was the moment of recalibration that happens when something you've been carrying as an accident becomes a crime, and every memory recontextualizes simultaneously. 4 men, he said. Yes. Garrison, Pollack, the Reyes brothers. Yes. He turned around. His face was not the face of a person who was losing control. It was the face of a person who has decided something, clearly and completely, and is now in the stage that comes after deciding. Who did it? I don't have a name yet. I have an organizational signature. The external access that injected the transmission was routed through a commercial logistics network, defense contractor infrastructure. Whoever did this had enough access to military communications to spoof an authentication protocol, and enough reason to want your Elements operation stopped that they were willing to kill 4 American soldiers to do it. What operation were we running? She met his eyes. You don't know? We were told it was a capture mission, high-value target. We never got the full brief. It wasn't a capture mission. She picked up the communication device and turned it so he could see the screen. It was a surveillance operation. Your element was positioned to observe and document a weapons transfer. A very large weapons transfer through an area that several defense contractors had been trying to get exclusive logistics access to for 2 years. He looked at the screen. He read what was on it. He read it twice. Someone was protecting a weapons network, he said. Someone was protecting a contract. The network was the collateral. 4 men died so that a defense contractor could maintain its logistics monopoly in a region worth approximately $2 billion in annual federal contracts. She paused. And now the only surviving member of the element that witnessed the preparation for that transfer is in a hospital in Caldwell, Oregon, with a medication order in his chart that would have killed him before he could talk to anyone. The storage unit was very quiet. Outside, a truck moved past on the road, its light sweeping briefly across the gap under the roll door. You've been tracking this for 4 years, Webb said. On and off. I left the service in 2019. I went into nursing because it was the cleanest cover I could build. Hospitals have access to federal patient registries, including VA transfers. I could track where you were without flagging anything. She hesitated. I know how that sounds. It sounds like you spent 4 years waiting for me to show up somewhere you could get to me. Yes. Why? She looked at him directly. Because I sent that transmission. I know I was used. I know I didn't know. But I sent it, and 4 men are dead, and you've been living with the aftermath of something that was done to you deliberately. And the people who did it have been running defense contracts and attending industry conferences and building careers for 4 years while you've been bouncing between VA facilities. She stopped. Let that sit. I owe you the truth, and I owe you whatever comes after the truth. He didn't say anything for a long time. The communication device was still in her hand, the screen still lit. The analyst, he said finally. The one who found the metadata. Where is he? The screen in her hand went dark. She looked down at it, and something in her face changed, something that was there and then carefully wasn't, in the way of a person who has learned to manage what shows. He died, she said, 7 months ago. Officially a traffic accident. Webb said nothing. That's when I applied for the position at Harwick, she said. The implication settled between them without needing to be spoken. The analyst had found something. The analyst had died. And whoever had been content to leave Webb in the VA system had become suddenly, urgently interested in ensuring he did not survive long enough to be found by anyone who knew what to look for. They know you're here, Webb said. They knew before tonight. The medication order required someone to read your chart in detail, identify your vulnerabilities, calculate a safe-looking dose. That takes time. That took preparation. Which means someone has known about me for longer than I'd like. How long? Long enough. She powered the communication device back on. Which is why I sent the message tonight. I have a contact, someone I trust, someone with access to federal investigative channels. I've been sending him information in segments for the last 6 weeks. Tonight I sent him the medication order and the access log showing the override attempt. And now we wait to see if that's enough to move something officially, or if we're going to have to do this the other way. What's the other way? She looked at him. He looked at her. Let's hope it doesn't come to that, she said. It came to that. At 5:47 a.m., her contact responded. The message was short. The Federal Investigative Channel was interested but required a formal witness statement from someone with first-hand operational knowledge before they could open a classified file review. They needed Webb, on record, coherent and credible, and willing to go through a process that would take weeks and expose him to institutional scrutiny he had spent years trying to avoid. And there was a second part of the message. The access attempt on the hospital's medication override system had been traced. Not to a specific person, the routing was sophisticated enough to require more time for a full attribution, but to a building. A commercial address in Portland, Oregon, registered to a subsidiary of a defense logistics firm called Van Trade Solutions. Claire read the name twice. She had seen it before. Not in the analyst's files. In an older document, one she had obtained through channels she was not going to describe in any statement she ever gave officially. A contract filing. A federal procurement record. Van Trade Solutions had held exclusive logistics contracts in the region where Webb's element had been operating in 2018. She did not tell Webb the name immediately. She put the device down and she sat with it for a moment. The specific, heavy moment of realizing that what you suspected is real, that the thing you built a 4-year shadow life to investigate is not a theory anymore, that you are now in a situation where the people who killed 4 soldiers and tried to kill a 5th are aware that their plan has failed and are currently deciding what to do about it. She had been in high-stakes situations before. She had worked in classified environments. She had transmitted intelligence in active combat theaters. She had spent 3 months in a debriefing process that was designed to be psychologically exhausting. But she had done all of that as part of a structure, with institutional backing, with chain of command, with the specific comfort of knowing that if something went wrong, there was someone whose job it was to respond. She did not have that now. She had a storage unit in Draper Falls, a recovering soldier with a compromised shoulder, and a contact who needed more than she currently had to give before they would move. She told Webb about Van Trade. He listened. He sat on the cot and he listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not respond at all. "I know that name," he said. She looked at him. "Not from the operation, after. A year after, maybe 14 months. I was in a transitional housing program through the VA, and there was a guy there, former logistics officer. He'd been trying to file a complaint against a defense contractor for fraudulent procurement reporting, and he kept getting shut down. He mentioned Van Trade twice, said they had people inside the contracting review board." He paused. "I didn't think about it at the time. I wasn't in a good place. I filed it and moved on." "Do you remember his name?" "Donahue. First name I never got. He was transferred to a different facility about 2 weeks after that conversation." She made a note. She did not say that Donahue was probably not findable now, or if he was findable that the circumstances of finding him might not be comfortable. She did not say it because it was the kind of speculation that consumed energy without producing anything useful, and they were going to need their energy. "We need to get you on record," she said. "Not full statement yet. Enough to let my contact open the file. That means we need somewhere secure, communication equipment I can trust, and time. I can give you the operational detail from the mission, what I saw, what I was told, what didn't match." He paused. "I've been over it in my head about 4,000 times. I know. Does it help that I've been over it?" She met his eyes. "It means your testimony will be specific. That helps a lot." He nodded. He looked tired. Not the dissociated exhaustion of the first nights at Harwick, but something cleaner than that. The tiredness of a person who has been carrying something alone for a long time and has just passed part of the weight to someone else. "You should have told me sooner," he said. Not accusatory, just true. "I know." She stood up. "I needed to know you were coherent enough to receive it. And the medication order, if I'd been sedated, you would have died, and it would have looked like a sepsis complication, and the file would have stayed buried." She kept her voice even. "That's what they were counting on." He absorbed that. He looked at his hands, at the IV site she'd covered on his forearm, at the wall of the storage unit with its bare metal and its single overhead light. "What do we do now?" he said. First, she moved to the second waterproof case and opened it. Inside were 2 prepaid phones, a portable satellite transceiver, a folder of printed documents, and at the very bottom, underneath the documents, a service pistol she had not used in 3 years. She looked at it for a half second and then picked up one of the prepaid phones. First, I make a call. Then we figure out where we can go that isn't on any record that Van Trade has access to. You think they have access to federal records? I think a company that successfully injected a fabricated order into a military authentication system in 2018 has access to things I don't want to assume they don't have access to. She powered on the prepaid phone. It connected. Signal was weak but present. She was one digit from completing the number when the storage unit's exterior light, the motion sensor flood on the access road, 60 feet from the roll door, came on. Webb was already off the cot. She held up 2 fingers. Wait. She moved to the gap at the bottom of the roll door and looked out. A vehicle had parked at the end of the access road, half in the shadow of the tree line. Dark. Engine off. No visible movement. It had not been there when they arrived. She straightened up and looked at Webb across the lit space between them, and he looked back at her. And the thing they communicated in that look was wordless and immediate, and did not require the 4 years of history behind it to be perfectly understood. The situation had changed again, and there was no version of the next 10 minutes that was going to be simple. She killed the overhead light first. The storage unit dropped into complete darkness, and she moved by memory. 3 steps left, hand on the second case, fingers finding the pistol grip without fumbling. She did not draw it yet. She held it at her side and moved to the wall beside the roll door and waited. And in the darkness she could hear Webb moving too, slow and deliberate, repositioning without her having to tell him to. Outside, the floodlight was still on. Whatever had triggered the motion sensor was still within its range, which meant it hadn't moved, which meant it was waiting. She pressed her back to the metal wall and thought through what she had. One exit, the roll door. One vehicle, her Subaru, parked 12 feet from the door on the access road's near side. One injured man who could move but not fight at full capacity. One pistol, loaded, that she had not fired in 3 years and hoped she still didn't have to. And one vehicle of unknown occupancy sitting at the end of the access road in the dark. Side panel, Webb said. Very quiet. She looked. On the right-hand interior wall, 4 feet up from the floor, was a ventilation panel about 18 inches square. She had noted it when she rented the unit, but had not thought about it as an exit because under normal circumstances a person couldn't fit through 18 inches of ventilation panel. Under normal circumstances. I'll go first, he said. Your shoulder. I'll go first. She didn't argue. She moved to the panel and used the flat of her hand to find the edge and push. It had a simple interior latch, the kind that hadn't been maintained since the unit was built, and it scraped badly when it moved, and she winced at the sound, and then it was open. Cold air came through. She could see the gravel edge of the access road's far drainage ditch, and beyond it, a fence line, and beyond the fence, a dark field. Webb went through the panel head first, and she heard him hit the ground on the other side, and the sound he made was brief and controlled, the sound of a person absorbing pain without giving it much space. Then she handed the second waterproof case through the gap and followed it. The cold hit her immediately. 41 degrees, maybe less, with a wind coming off the field that cut through her scrubs without much difficulty. She was not dressed for this. Neither was Webb, who was standing upright against the exterior wall of the storage unit looking at the fence line with his right hand pressed to his left shoulder. Go, she said. They went over the fence. She went first because she could do it in 4 seconds and he needed to see the footholds. And across the field at an angle that kept them away from the floodlight's range. The grass was wet. Her shoes were soaked within 30 seconds. The field was about 200 meters across, and on the far side was a 2-lane road with no streetlights and a grain depot that had been closed for the season. She stopped at the road's edge and looked back at the storage unit. The floodlight was still on. The vehicle at the end of the access road had not moved. They're not following, Webb said. No. They're waiting for us to come back out through the door. Yes. She looked at him in the thin light. He was pale. The shoulder was bad enough that it showed even in the dark. You're bleeding. I know, not arterial. I know it's not arterial. That's not the problem. She set the case down and opened it and took out the first aid kit she'd packed 3 weeks ago and handed him 2 gauze pads and a pressure wrap. Hold these against it. You need to make the call. I'm making it. She picked up the prepaid phone. The signal out here was 1 bar, intermittent, but 1 bar was enough if the connection was voice. She dialed the number she had been 1 digit from completing when the floodlight came on. and it rang 3 times, and then a man's voice answered, tired, alert in the way of a person who slept with their phone close and had been expecting this call. "Kelso," she said. "It's me." A pause. "You're not in the hospital." "No." "Is he with you?" "Yes." "Is he able?" She looked at Webb, who was applying the pressure wrap to his own shoulder with one hand, which was not going well, and who would rather bleed than ask for help. "Well enough. I need you to move the federal request forward." "Claire," the voice on the other end was careful, "I told you the process requires someone just deployed a tail on a storage unit in Draper Falls, Oregon. That means they know about the unit, which means they have access to financial records under an alias I set up 18 months ago, which means either their intelligence reach is broader than we thought or someone on your end has talked." Silence. "I need the file open now," she said. "Not through the standard channel, direct. And I need a location." "This is not how it works." "I know how it works. I built part of how it works. And right now the way it works is getting people killed." She kept her voice flat. This was not the time for emotion. She knew that. She'd known it for years. Emotion in high-pressure communication was a tax on clarity, and she couldn't afford the tax right now. Webb has operational detail from the August 2018 mission. Firsthand. Credible. Give me a secure location in 12 hours and I'll give you enough for a classified file review and a formal hold on Van Trade Solutions. Another silence. Longer this time. "There's a facility in Bend," Kelso said. "I can have it cleared by 0600. That's 2 hours. That's the fastest I can do it without it appearing on a routing log that I can't control." "Fine." She looked at the road. "We'll need transport. My car is compromised. There's a freight company off Highway 20 outside Draper Falls called Morrow Transit. Ask for the overnight dispatcher. Tell them Kelso sent you. They'll sort it." "That's your asset?" "That's a man who owes me a favor and has a truck going to Bend at 4:15. A pause. "Be careful." She disconnected. She put the phone in her pocket and picked up the case and looked at Webb. "Can you walk 2 miles?" He had finished the pressure wrap. It was slightly uneven on the left side, but it was firm, and the bleeding had slowed enough that the outer layer wasn't saturating. "I can walk 2 miles. Don't tell me what I want to hear." "I'm not." He picked up the case before she could. 2 miles. Let's go." The Morrow Transit dispatcher was a woman in her late 50s named Pat, who looked at them across the counter of a prefab office that smelled of diesel and stale coffee and said absolutely nothing about the scrubs, the field mud on their shoes, or the pressure wrap visible at Webb's collar. She made one phone call, said 3 words to whoever answered, and pointed at a truck idling outside that was loaded with agricultural equipment headed for a distribution center in Bend. The driver was 23 and listening to a podcast about competitive fishing and had no interest in conversation. They rode in the cab in silence while the highway unreeled ahead of them in the dark, and Webb dozed with his head against the window in the specific way of a person who had learned to sleep in vehicles because the alternative was not sleeping, and Claire sat with her hands in her lap and thought about what she was going to say to a federal investigator in 2 hours. She had been preparing this for 4 years. She had organized it, structured it, built the evidentiary chain in her head until she could walk through it without notes. She knew what she had and what she was missing and what she would need Webb's testimony to supply. She had done everything she could think of to do. She was still scared. That was the part nobody prepared you for, that doing everything right and being scared were not mutually exclusive, that the fear didn't indicate a problem with the preparation, that it was just present alongside it the way weather was present, and you went out in it anyway. Outside, the highway was dark. They passed a shuttered rest stop, a logging truck going the other direction, a billboard for a medical clinic that she didn't read. Webb's head was still against the window. I wasn't asleep. She could tell by the quality of his stillness, too controlled for sleep. But he wasn't talking, and she didn't interrupt it. She thought about the 4 names he had said in the storage unit. Garrison, Pollock, the Reyes brothers. 4 syllables, or 3 or 2, depending on how you said them. And behind each of them was an entire architecture of people who were missing someone. Parents, siblings, partners, children in some cases. People who had been told combat operation, unavoidable risk, and had believed it because there was no alternative to believing it, because the alternative was that someone had decided their person was an acceptable sacrifice for a contract renewal. She had not slept in 22 hours. She noticed that the way you notice things at a distance. Oh. The facility in Bend was not a federal building. It was a law office on a quiet commercial street, the kind of address that didn't announce itself, which was the point. A man met them at the side entrance at 6:08 a.m., 6 minutes late, which he apologized for without explaining, and led them through a hallway that smelled like new carpet and old filing cabinets, and into a conference room with a table, 4 chairs, a recording setup, and a woman who introduced herself only as Investigator Marsh, no first name, federal insignia on her ID that Claire recognized as the correct agency for this specific category of inquiry. She was not the Rosalind Marsh from the hospital. Same last name, no connection. Investigator Marsh looked at Webb and then at Claire, and she did the thing that people with her training did when they were making an initial assessment. A visual sweep that covered exits, body language, relative positioning, and the pressure wrap on Webb's shoulder, in approximately that order. "We have limited time before this location appears in a pattern analysis," she said. "Let's work efficiently." Webb's testimony took 94 minutes. Claire sat against the far wall and did not speak. She had given her own accounting in a separate room, first, in 40 minutes, with a second investigator who asked clean, specific questions and did not react visibly to any of the answers. She had handed over everything on the communication device, everything she had encrypted and stored and transmitted in segments, and had watched the investigator upload it to a federal server without comment. Webb was specific. He was, as she'd told him he would be, precise about operational detail, coordinates, timings, the exact content of the briefing he'd been given, and the ways in which what they encountered in the field had diverged from it. He talked about the route update that had redirected his team into the kill zone. He talked about the ambush itself with the flat, factual specificity of someone who has replayed it enough times that the emotional register has been separated from the informational content. He talked about the 4 men he'd lost in a way that had no performance in it, no attempt to leverage grief as persuasion, just the names and the sequence and the weight of it sitting in the room without needing to be dramatized. Investigator Marsh asked good questions. She pushed on the things that needed pushing on. She did not accept vague answers, and when Webb said, "I don't know," she noted it and moved on without making it a problem, because "I don't know" from a credible source was information too. At 7:42 a.m., Investigator Marsh set her pen down and looked at the recorder. "We have enough to open the file," she said. Claire exhaled. She had not realized she'd been holding something against that moment until it passed. "Van Trade Solutions," Marsh said, looking at Claire now. "The name appears in 3 of the documents you transmitted. I want to be transparent with you. I'm familiar with the company. They're major. Active federal contracts totaling somewhere above $3 billion. The review process for an organization of that scale, even with compelling preliminary evidence, is not going to be fast." "How not fast?" Webb said. "Months, possibly longer. People were trying to kill me 2 hours ago." "I understand that, which is why protective placement is going to be part of this conversation." She paused. "Both of you." "I'm not going into a placement program," Claire said. "I understand that too. But what you've built over 4 years becomes significantly less useful if you're not alive." Marsh looked at her with the particular patience of someone who has had this conversation before and knows that the outcome is rarely simple. "I'm not asking you to disappear. I'm asking you to be strategic about exposure, and I'm asking you to let this process move at the pace it has to move." "What moves faster?" Webb said. Marsh looked at him. "There's always something that moves faster," he said. "There's always a pressure point, evidence of imminent threat, a current operational signature, something that gets the process compressed." He had the tone of a man who had spent years in institutions that had their own logic and had learned to work within that logic without being fooled by it. What would compress the timeline? Marsh was quiet for a moment. "Active evidence of ongoing criminal coordination," she said, "something that connects Van Trade's current operational structure to the 2018 events directly. Not historical documentation, current, real time." "How current?" "If someone at Van Trade authorized the medication order at Harwick Memorial in the last 48 hours, and that authorization can be traced to a named individual with authority in the company's current command structure, we can move to a criminal referral within 72 hours. That changes the speed entirely." "The access log from the hospital override attempt," Claire said. "It's in your transmitted materials. My technical team is working the attribution now. But the routing is sophisticated. We may not get a named individual from that alone. We need a second point of connection. The room was quiet. Outside, the commercial street was starting to show morning traffic. A delivery vehicle went past. Normal life, 6 feet from a conversation that was the opposite of normal. "There's an event," Claire said. Marsh looked at her. Van Trade Solutions hosts a quarterly logistics symposium. Industry partners, federal procurement officers, subcontractors. The next one is in 8 days. She paused. Their CEO will be there, Victor Harlan. He's been the company's public face for 7 years, and based on the organizational structure in their procurement filings, any decision to deploy a surveillance and elimination operation against a protected witness would require authorization at his level. "You know about the symposium. I've been researching this company for 14 months. Marsh's expression was neutral and careful. "What are you proposing?" "I'm proposing that the fastest way to give you active evidence of ongoing criminal coordination is to be inside that symposium. With the right documentation and access, I can produce the second point of connection you're describing." "That's not—" Marsh stopped. She looked at Webb, then back at Claire. "That's not something I can authorize." "I know. You'd be walking into a room with people who tried to kill you in the last 12 hours. "I know that too." Claire held her gaze. "I've been in worse rooms." Marsh was quiet for a long time. Outside, the delivery vehicle had gone. The street was ordinary again. "I can't authorize it," she said. "But I can tell you that if such an event were to produce credible real-time evidence, properly documented, transmitted through the right channels, the institutional machinery that currently requires months would move considerably faster." She looked at her recorder. "Off the record." She reached over and stopped it. 8 days, Claire said. 8 days. Marsh opened her folder. "Now let's talk about where you're staying in the meantime, because I have a more immediate problem, and its name is Harwick Memorial Hospital, which has already filed a missing patient report with local police, and your name is in it." The report had gone in at 5:30 a.m. Dr. Alderman had authorized it, which was both faster and more aggressive than Claire would have predicted for a man who'd seemed primarily motivated by documentation and self-protection. But a patient disappearing from the ICU in the middle of the night, particularly one with Webb status, was the kind of event that attracted institutional attention whether anyone wanted it to or not. The local police inquiry was routine. They had no context for what had actually happened, and no reason to think it was anything other than a confused patient who had walked out during a destabilized episode. But the hospital's internal review, which Marsh told them had been initiated by the chief medical officer rather than Alderman, was going to surface Claire's modifications to the medication scheduling, her flagged pharmacy alert, and the record of the override attempt on the hospital's own access logs. "Which is actually useful," Marsh said. "The hospital's IT team will find the override attempt independently, and when they do, they'll file a security report with the Oregon Health Authority. That creates an official record that doesn't trace to either of you." "How long?" Webb said. 24 to 72 hours. Depends on how fast their IT department moves." Claire thought about the IT infrastructure at Harwick Memorial and its single overnight systems administrator, who was also responsible for scheduling the maintenance calendar for the building's HVAC system. 72 hours, she said. "Likely. In the meantime, I can put both of you in a private arrangement, not a federal facility, nothing that shows up in a system Van Trade might access. A private address, clean utilities, minimal exposure." Marsh paused. "It's not comfortable." "We don't need comfortable," Webb said. "Well, the private address was a house in a small town called Henley Crossing, 60 miles south of Bend, owned by a retired schoolteacher named Earl, who grew tomatoes in raised beds and had 3 decades of security sector history that Claire decided not to ask about. Earl showed them the back bedroom and the bathroom and the section of the kitchen cabinet where he kept the medical supplies. And he did not ask questions, and he cooked eggs at 8 in the morning and left them on the table and went to work in his garden. Claire redressed Webb's shoulder properly, with the right materials, under actual light. The bleeding had stopped, but the site was inflamed, and the tissue around it was showing signs that the physical stress of the last 6 hours had set his recovery back by at least 3 days. She told him this. "I know," he said. "You need to stay ahead of the infection risk. That means keeping the site clean, keeping your fluid intake up, and not doing anything in the next 8 days that involves that arm." He looked at her. "I know," she said. "I'm telling you anyway. She cleaned the wound. He made no sound. She noted that he had the specific pain tolerance of a person who had spent years teaching their body to treat pain as information rather than event. And she noted it without admiring it, because that particular adaptation had a cost that showed up in other places. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. "The symposium," he said. "Yes." "You're going in as what? You can't use your own credentials." "I have secondary documentation. It's solid enough for a one-time event." She capped the antiseptic. "Conference registration is handled through a third-party platform. I can create a credible attendee profile for a logistics consulting firm. And if someone at Van Trade makes you, then I'll know I was right about their reach, which is useful even if it's unpleasant." She looked at him. "I'm not going in without a way out." "You're going in alone." "I'm going in with documentation and a transmitter, and you'll have a line to Kelso." "That's not—" He stopped. He was doing the same calculation she had done and arriving at the same answer, which was that the math of 8 days versus months was not a hard calculation when the alternative was 8 months of exposure while Van Trade's people looked for another angle. "I want eyes on the building." "You can't—" "Not inside. Outside." He was firm, not heated. Webb didn't heat up. She'd noticed that. He got quiet and certain instead, which was its own kind of force. "External position. I don't need the left arm to observe and report." She thought about it. The symposium venue was a convention center in Portland. Outdoor positions with line of sight to the main entrance were available. She had already looked at the layout. If he was positioned by the time she went in, and if he maintained communication discipline, the risk was manageable. Manageable was not the same as good. She knew that. But they were past the point where good was on the table. "Okay," she said. "Okay." He settled back against the headboard. 8 days. 8 days. She went to the kitchen and sat at the table in front of Earl's eggs, and thought through everything she needed to do before the symposium, and the list was long, and some of it was dangerous, and all of it needed to happen in sequence, and she was tired enough that the edges of her thinking were starting to soften. She ate the eggs. She drank the coffee that was still in the pot. She let herself be tired for exactly the length of time it took to finish eating, and then she picked up the prepaid phone and started making the first of the calls she needed to make. The 7 days that followed were their own kind of sustained pressure, not the acute reactive pressure of the hospital or the storage unit or the dark field outside Draper Falls, but the slower, grinding pressure of preparation under uncertainty. Claire built the conference identity piece by piece: documentation, registration, a backstory that was internally consistent and verifiable to the depth that a casual check would reach. She contacted Kelso twice and Marsh once, and received information she needed and some she didn't, and she moved through the days in the careful, systematic way she'd learned in a career that no longer officially existed. Webb recovered faster than she'd expected and slower than he wanted, which was exactly accurate for the man she'd come to know in fragments over the last 3 weeks. He was difficult in the particular way of physically capable people who are forced to be stationary, restless, sharp-edged, at odd moments, apologizing for the sharp-edged moments in a way that was clearly unfamiliar to him. He reviewed every element of her conference plan and identified 3 vulnerabilities she had already found, and 2 she hadn't. He did not make a performance of finding them. He just pointed at them, and they fixed them. On the 6th evening, he asked her something he'd been carrying for a while. She could tell because of the pause before it, the particular pause of a person who has been deciding whether to ask. "When this is over," he said, "what do you do?" She thought about it. She was looking at the window, at the dark outside, at Earl's tomato garden invisible in the night. "Nurse," she said. "That's it?" "That's what I am now." She looked at him. "I'm not going back to what I was before. That's done." He was quiet. "I'm not going back either. I don't have a before that I want back." "No." "So what does after look like?" She didn't have a clean answer for that. She told him so, and he accepted it the way he accepted most things, without argument, with a kind of considered patience that she thought was probably a recent acquisition, built in the years since the ambush, since the VA facilities, since the long education in what it meant to keep moving without a direction that made sense. "One thing at a time," she said. "Yeah." On the 8th morning, she dressed in a gray blazer and dark slacks and credentials that identified her as a logistics consultant named Elaine Voss from a firm in Seattle. and she checked the transmitter twice and the secondary device once and put the phone in her inside pocket. She looked at Webb across the kitchen, and he was sitting at the table with coffee in his right hand and the look on his face of a person who understands risk and has accepted it and is not going to say anything else about it. "If you see something wrong from outside, you call Kelso first," she said. "Not me, Kelso." "I know." "If I'm not out in 3 hours, you call Kelso." "I know, Claire." "And don't use the left arm." He almost smiled. Almost. She left the house. The Cascadia Convention Center in Portland was a converted industrial building on the river, 4 stories, glass and exposed steel. The kind of architecture that said serious money without shouting it. The Van Trade Solutions Quarterly Logistics Symposium had drawn approximately 300 attendees, defense contractors, federal procurement consultants, logistics managers, a contingent of people in suits whose lanyards bore agency identifiers Claire recognized and cataloged without looking directly at them. She checked in at the registration desk at 9:47 a.m. The volunteer scanned her QR code, handed her a badge, and pointed her toward the main hall. Nobody looked at her twice. The first hour was exactly what it appeared to be: presentations, coffee stations, industry talk that meant nothing and everything depending on who was listening. She moved through the space methodically, building a layout in her head, identifying the back-of-house access points, the catering corridor, the security presence, which was private contractor, not building staff. She placed the transmitter in the location she'd identified from the floor plan 6 days ago. Victor Harlan was not hard to find. He was the gravitational center of the room, not by height or volume, but by the way the crowd oriented around him. 61 years old, silver-haired, with the particular ease of a man who had spent decades in rooms where he was the most powerful person present and had stopped noticing it. He was talking to 3 men in suits and 1 woman with a federal agency lanyard, and he was smiling the way people smile when they are not actually amused but have learned that smiling produces compliance. She watched him for 4 minutes from across the hall. At 11:15, she followed the catering corridor to the back-of-house area and found the server room she had identified from the building's public facilities documentation, and she opened the case she'd brought in the conference tote and set up the secondary connection to the Van Trade internal network via the access protocol that Kelso's technical team had reverse-engineered from the hospital override attempt. It worked, which meant the hospital override had been run through Van Trade's proprietary system. She started the extraction sequence and watched the progress bar and thought about the 4 names. The extraction was at 63% when the door opened. She turned around. Victor Harlan stood in the doorway. He was alone, which told her one of 2 things. Either he had come to check the server room for reasons entirely unrelated to her, or he had known she was there. The 2 seconds between those possibilities were the longest 2 seconds she'd experienced in recent memory. He looked at her, at the device on the server rack, at the progress bar. And then something happened that she had not predicted in all her preparation, in all her 4 years of building this. His expression did not show surprise. It showed recognition. "You're not Elaine Voss," he said. He stepped into the room and let the door close behind him. He was calm in a way that was more frightening than anger would have been. "I've been wondering when you'd turn up." The progress bar hit 81%. "Mr. Harlan," she said. She kept her voice level. She was aware of the weight of the phone in her inside pocket, of Kelso's number on the first speed dial, of the distance between herself and the door behind him. 4 years is a long time to carry something," he said. He moved to the right side of the room, not toward her, but the movement changed the geometry between them and the door. "I want you to understand something. I made decisions in 2018 that I did not make lightly. Decisions that protected 4 men died." He paused. 4 American soldiers," she said, "and you've been building infrastructure contracts on their graves for 4 years. The progress bar hit 97%. His hand moved to his jacket pocket. She had exactly the time it took for the bar to reach 100 to decide what she was going to do. And the bar was moving, and his hand was moving. And in the room above them, 300 people were drinking coffee and talking about logistics, and had no idea that the thing that had been buried for 4 years was coming to the surface right now, in this moment, whether anyone was ready for it or not. The bar hit 100. The transfer completed. And Victor Harlan took a step toward her. She moved before he completed the step. Not toward the door. He was between her and the door, And closing that distance was what he wanted. It gave him reach and control and the geometry of a confined space working in his favor. She moved sideways toward the server rack, putting the equipment between them and buying herself 2 feet in 1 second, which was what she had. His hand came out of his jacket pocket, and it was not a weapon. It was a phone. He was dialing something one-handed and watching her with the specific calm of a man who had already decided the situation was under control and was executing a plan he'd made before he walked through the door. She understood immediately. He hadn't come to stop the extraction. He'd come to confirm it was her. He'd already known someone was in the room, had known for long enough to prepare, which meant the building had its own sensors she hadn't accounted for, or someone had flagged the network access from outside, or both. And now he was calling whoever came next. She hit the speed dial on her own phone before he finished dialing his. Kelso picked up on the first ring. "Transfer complete," she said. "I need immediate—" "Already moving," Kelso said. "Stay on the line." She put the phone in her blazer pocket with the line open and looked at Harlan. He had stopped dialing. He was looking at her phone with an expression that was recalibrating, the specific expression of a man who has made an accurate assessment of a situation and then discovered the situation has one more variable than he accounted for. "Who did you send it to?" he said. "Federal investigators. The transmission completed 90 seconds ago. Whatever you're planning to do right now, it's already too late for the part that matters." He looked at her for a long moment. The room was very quiet. Outside the door, she could hear the muffled sound of the conference, voices, movement, the low hum of an event proceeding normally on the other side of a wall. "You don't understand what you've done," he said. "I understand exactly what I've done. You've opened a process that's going to take— I know how long it takes. I spent 4 years learning how long it takes." She kept the server rack between them. "What I've given them today compresses that timeline considerably. Current operational data, active criminal coordination, your authentication signature on the hospital override attempt, routed through this building's proprietary system, time-stamped 48 hours ago." She paused. "That's not a historical document. That's evidence of an ongoing criminal conspiracy against a protected witness. That moves differently." Something shifted in his face. Not collapse. He was too controlled for collapse. But a recalibration, a reassessment, the internal adjustment of a person who has just received information that changes the shape of the problem he's managing. "You were the comms officer," he said. "Yes." "I didn't know who transmitted the order until 2 years later. By then—" He stopped. "By then it didn't matter to you whether I knew or not. By then you were already out of the service. You weren't a threat." "And Marcus Webb?" He didn't answer immediately. He moved to his left, not toward her, toward the far wall, the way people move when they're thinking, unconscious repositioning that tracks the direction of their thoughts. Webb was a liability that became active when his VA record started getting accessed from an Oregon hospital IP. That flagged an alert in our system. You had an alert set on his VA record. On all of them, the surviving members of Bravo Element. She filed that. There were more. Webb had said 4 dead, but Bravo Element had been larger than that. "How many survivors?" 3. Webb was the first to become accessible. He looked at her. "The other 2 are outside my reach now. I want you to know that. I'm not a person who—" He stopped again. "Who what?" She kept her voice even. "Who wanted this? Who made decisions lightly?" She was aware of the phone in her pocket, of Kelso on the line hearing this, of the recording function she had activated before she walked into the building this morning. "You said that earlier, that you didn't make those decisions lightly. I'm curious what the weight-bearing process looks like for a decision that kills 4 American soldiers." His jaw tightened. She had found something, not guilt exactly, or not only guilt, something more complicated than that, which was the particular burden of a person who had made a catastrophic decision and had then spent 4 years building a structure of justification around it that was starting to show its load-bearing limits. "The contract was worth $2.3 billion, he said, "and the operation your soldiers' element was running would have exposed procurement irregularities that would have ended it, along with the careers of 7 federal contracting officials who had approved those irregularities. So you protected them too." "I protected a defense infrastructure that employs 40,000 people. You killed 4 men. War kills men. I redirected an operation. You fabricated a military order and inserted it into a secure command channel. That is not a redirection. That is a crime under federal statute, multiple counts, and you have just described it to me in a room where I have an active phone line to a federal investigator and a recording device that has been running for 40 minutes. She let that sit. I need you to understand that nothing you say in the next 10 seconds changes what has already been transmitted. But what you say may be the difference between whether you walk out of this building under your own control or under someone else's. Harlan was very still. She could hear from her blazer pocket the faint ambient sound that was Kelso breathing and not speaking. "You're not law enforcement," Harlan said. It came out quieter than his previous sentences. Quieter in the way of a man who is trying to find a thread to pull. "No, I'm a witness. The law enforcement is coming." She checked her watch. It had been 4 minutes and 30 seconds since she told Kelso the transfer was complete. Kelso had said already moving. She did not know exactly what that meant in terms of arrivals, but she knew Marsh had been briefed, and she knew the federal process for a real-time criminal evidence scenario moved faster than the standard review track, and she was betting on that. She was betting on a lot of things right now. "Walk me through the door," she said. "Back into the conference. We wait in a public space for what comes next. You retain the appearance of control for however long that lasts, which I genuinely can't predict. Or you make whatever move you were thinking about when you stepped toward me 3 minutes ago, and we find out which version of this ends your career faster." He looked at her for a long time. Then he walked to the door. The conference was still running. Harlan led her back into the main hall, at a pace that was measured and unhurried, and she walked beside him in the specific proximity of two people who are performing an ordinary interaction for an audience of 300 who would not know what they were watching even if they looked directly at it. She kept her left hand near her blazer pocket and her eyes on the room's sightlines, checking the main entrance, the secondary entrance on the south wall, the security contractor near the catering station who had not changed position in the last 40 minutes. Then the south entrance opened. 2 men came through first, in suits that were cut for concealment, moving with the particular gait of people who are doing a job and don't care who notices. Behind them, Investigator Marsh in a blazer, no lanyard, no visible credentials, with 2 more people flanking her. And behind them, through the still open south door, Claire could see the edge of a uniformed presence that had not been there when she arrived. The security contractor by the catering station saw it and reached for his radio. One of the suited men was beside him in 6 seconds, and the radio didn't complete a transmission. The conference room noise dropped. Not immediately. It took about 15 seconds for the attention to shift, for people to notice the new configuration, for the specific quality of the room to change from professional gathering to something that had no polite category. Marsh walked directly across the hall floor toward Claire and Harlan. She did not hurry. She covered the distance with the steady, deliberate pace of a person who has time and knows it, who has already determined that the outcome of the next 10 minutes is not in question and is simply executing the final steps. She stopped 2 feet from them and looked at Victor Harlan. "Mr. Harlan, I'm federal investigator Dana Marsh. I have a criminal referral order and a judicial hold on Van Trade Solutions federal contracts, effective 47 minutes ago." She held out a document. "I'm going to ask you to come with me." Harlan looked at the document. He looked at Claire. She said nothing. There was nothing to say. He took the document and read the first paragraph and handed it back to Marsh. Then he did something she hadn't predicted. He straightened his jacket, squared his shoulders, and said, "I'd like my attorney." "You'll have that opportunity," Marsh said. She nodded to one of the suited men who moved into position beside Harlan. Not aggressively, no cuffs yet, not in the middle of a conference hall, which was a choice that was about optics and process and the specific choreography of federal actions in semi-public spaces. Harlan would be walked out with dignity intact until the door closed behind him, and then the dignity part would be over. Claire watched him cross the hall toward the south entrance. 300 people watched with varying degrees of understanding. Someone near the coffee station had their phone out. The event coordinator was talking rapidly into a headset. Marsh was at her elbow. "The data transferred clean," she said quietly. "Technical team had it inside 2 minutes. They've already flagged 12 communication records that connect Harlan directly to the 2018 command channel injection." She paused. "That's more than we needed." "I know." "Are you all right?" Claire thought about that question, genuinely thought about it, not the automatic yes that was the only socially acceptable answer in most circumstances. "I'm functional," she said. "Where's Webb?" Your contact called him in when the operation went active. He's outside. She walked toward the south entrance through a hall that had stopped pretending to be a conference. The air outside was cold and moving, a river wind that came off the water 2 blocks west and hit the glass face of the convention center without apology. Webb was standing on the plaza 40 feet from the south entrance, which was not the external position she had specified. The external position was on a rise to the north with line of sight to the main entrance, which meant he had moved when the federal vehicles arrived, and he had moved toward the building rather than away from it, because of course he had. He looked at her. She looked at him. Shoulder, she said. I didn't use it. You walked 200 meters on uneven ground when you were supposed to be stationary. You walked into a room with the man who tried to have me killed. She didn't have a good answer for that. She stopped in front of him and looked at his face, which was tired and relieved and something else that was harder to name. The expression of a person who has been carrying a verdict for 4 years and has just heard the first word of a different one. It transferred, she said. I heard. Kelso called. It's going to take time. The process. I know. He looked at the south entrance, where Harlan was being walked through by Marsh's team, where the uniformed presence she'd seen from inside was resolving into a mix of federal and local, 3 agencies at minimum, coordinated, which meant Marsh had built a response that didn't depend on any single chain of command. Is it enough? It's enough to move. Marsh said 12 direct communications records. That's enough to hold him, enough to freeze the contracts, enough to open the broader investigation into the contracting officials he mentioned. She paused. The other 2 survivors. Bravo Element. We need to get their names to Marsh. I have them. He had always had them. She understood that the same way she understood most things about him. In retrospect, once she had enough information to see the shape of something she'd been looking at from the wrong angle. I didn't know if they were still... He stopped. I didn't know their status. I'll find out. She looked at him. We'll find out. He nodded. He was looking past her, at the entrance, at the last visible edge of Victor Harlan, before the federal team moved him to a vehicle. His expression was not triumph. She had seen people who expected triumph for moments like this. The exhilarating rush of a long-sought thing finally arrived, and that was not what was on Webb's face. What was on his face was the particular exhaustion that comes when something you have been braced against for years finally stops pushing back, and you realize how much of your structural capacity you've been using just to stand upright. Come on, she said. Marsh needs us inside. She started back toward the entrance. After a moment, he fell into step beside her, and she became aware that they were walking at the same pace, naturally, without adjustment, which was a small thing and not a small thing at all. The 3 hours that followed were administrative in the way that follows any large, complicated action: the documentation, the formal statements, the institutional mechanics of an investigation that was now open and moving. They sat in a conference room that Marsh's team had commandeered from the event coordinator, who had given it up with the specific shell-shocked compliance of someone who had prepared for a logistics symposium and received a federal operation instead. Claire gave a second statement, then a third, shorter one, clarifying specific elements from the first. She answered questions from 3 different investigators in sequence, and some of the questions were the same question asked differently, and she understood why. The formal record needed the answers to land the same way regardless of how the question arrived, and she answered them the same way each time. Webb's statement took longer. Marsh handled it personally, and Claire waited outside the room, and she drank coffee she didn't particularly want and watched the event coordinator try to discreetly notify 300 attendees that the symposium had concluded early. At 2:17 p.m., Marsh came out of Webb's interview room and sat down next to Claire. I want to be transparent with you, she said. It was the same phrase she'd used in Bend, which Claire now recognized as a specific verbal marker that preceded something she wasn't going to enjoy. The 12 communication records are going to do what I said they're going to do. Criminal referral, contract freeze, investigation opening. That's moving. Harlan will be charged within 72 hours. But the 7 contracting officials he mentioned. Marsh folded her hands on the table. Some of them are in positions that create complications. Not for the investigation itself. We'll get there. But for the timeline. There are people who are going to see what happened today and use the next few days to manage their exposure, create distance, move things. Can you stop that? Some of it, We're already serving preservation orders on digital records at 3 agencies. But institutional self-protection is faster than institutional accountability. It always is. She looked at Claire. This is not me telling you this falls apart. It doesn't fall apart. I'm telling you it takes longer than today, and in that time, you and Webb need to be somewhere that isn't connected to anything these officials have access to. Still. Claire nodded. She had known this. She had gone into today knowing that today was not the end. It was the beginning of the process that led to the end. The transfer, Harlan's arrest, the federal hold on the contracts. These were the first load-bearing pieces, not the last. The other 2 Bravo element survivors, she said. Webb is giving you the names. He has. We're locating them now. They need protective notification. Harlan said he had alerts on all of them. Already in process. Marsh stood. There's one more thing. She paused in the way of someone who has ordered their information and is choosing where to begin. The internal review at Harwick Memorial Hospital concluded this morning. The IT security report was filed yesterday. They found the override attempt on their own logs, as you predicted. The report has been forwarded to the Oregon Health Authority and has been cross-referenced with our federal filing. She looked at Claire with an expression that was professional and not entirely without warmth. Dr. Alderman's hospital credentials are under review for the medication order that was placed through his login. He didn't place it, and the attribution chain is going to clear him eventually, but the process requires he'll be difficult about that. He already has been. He's made 3 calls to hospital administration in the last 2 hours. A brief pause. The hospital's chief medical officer has also been informed of the full circumstances surrounding your departure and Sergeant Webb's. There will be an internal review of the nursing conduct complaints filed against you. I'm not expecting... I know you're not expecting anything. I'm telling you what's in motion. Marsh picked up her folder. Rest. We'll need you available for follow-up in the next 72 hours. And available doesn't mean you need to be in a federal building. It means reachable. She handed Claire a card. My direct line, not the office number. Oh. They stayed 2 more days in Portland in a hotel that Marsh's team arranged. Nothing with federal markings, nothing expensive. A clean, anonymous place near the river that smelled of fresh laundry and the specific neutrality of a space that housed hundreds of different lives without accumulating any particular character from any of them. Claire slept for 11 hours the first night, which was more sleep than she'd had in a single stretch and longer than she could accurately remember, and she woke up at 7:12 a.m. to 3 messages from Kelso, 1 from Marsh, and the sound of Webb in the adjacent room moving around with the careful, measured quality of a person doing morning mobility work on a shoulder that was improving but not forgiven. The messages from Kelso were updates. The contract freeze had been confirmed. Harlan had been formally charged with 2 counts that Kelso described in the bureaucratic shorthand of someone reading from a document, and Claire translated them mentally into their actual meanings. The fabricated military order and the hospital medication attempt. More charges were pending the investigation timeline. The message from Marsh was shorter. The 3rd Bravo element survivor, a man named Rios who had been living under a separate name in Idaho, had been located and notified and had agreed to formal protective status. The 2nd survivor, a woman named Taggart, who had left the service and was working as a civilian contractor in Arizona, had been harder to reach and had initially declined, and then after a second conversation with Marsh had agreed to at least speak with investigators. Claire forwarded both updates to Webb through the wall, which she did by knocking twice and then slipping a note under the door because their phones were being routed through a secure line and she did not entirely trust the hotel's Wi-Fi, which was a level of caution that was probably excessive and which she maintained anyway. She heard him read the note, or heard, rather, the particular quality of silence that followed when a person reads something that matters and goes still for a moment. Then he knocked back twice. She went to the window and looked at the river. The van trade operation was still running, was the thing. The contract freeze applied to federal procurement, but the company's private subsidiary work, its existing logistics infrastructure in 3 countries, its relationships with non-federal clients. None of that stopped because of a judicial hold. Harlan was charged, and his company was under federal scrutiny, and the contracting officials he'd named were managing their exposure as fast as they could, and all of that was real and consequential. And it was also not complete. It was not the end of something. It was the mechanism of an ending that was going to unfold on a timeline she could not control. She had always known that. She was not surprised by it. What she was, standing at the window in a hotel room in Portland, 2 days after walking into a server room with a transfer device and no backup except an open phone line, was tired in a way that was different from the tired of the last 8 days. The last 8 days had been the tiredness of active pressure, of continuous decision-making in constrained time, of maintaining functional capacity when sleep was a thing she was planning to do later. This was different. This was the tiredness that comes in the pause, when the active pressure lifts and the body tallies what was borrowed and presents the bill. She was standing at the window thinking about that when the knock came. Not her door, Webb's door, from the hallway. Then her own, immediately after. She went to the door. Through the peephole, a hotel staff member, female, with a trolley. Ordinary. She verified the staff ID against the hotel's publicly visible employee photo directory on her phone in 11 seconds. Clean. She opened the door. The staff member handed her an envelope. Hotel letterhead. Left at the front desk for a guest in your name, she said. Neutral. Professional. She left without waiting for a tip. Claire closed the door and turned the envelope over. No return address. No stamp. Hand-delivered to the front desk. Her cover name, Elaine Voss, written in small, very precise handwriting. She opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. On it, in the same precise handwriting, were 14 lines of numbers and letters. It took her 6 seconds to recognize the format. It was an encrypted communication string in a protocol she had not seen in 4 years. A protocol that had been exclusive to the Signals Intelligence Unit she had served in from 2016 to 2019. The unit that officially did not exist, whose records were classified above the level of the federal investigators she'd been speaking with for 2 days. Nobody outside that unit should have known the protocol format. The door between the rooms opened. Webb stood in the frame, his own envelope in his hand, the same hotel letterhead, a sheet of paper he'd already opened. He looked at her. She looked at him. Mine's the same format, he said. She looked back at her sheet and read the first 8 characters of the string, which in the protocol decoded to a sender identifier. She had memorized every sender identifier that had been active in her operational window. This one she didn't recognize, which meant it was new, which meant someone was currently using a dead protocol, a classified signal structure that had been decommissioned when the unit was officially dissolved, and had used it to send a message to both of them at a hotel that was supposed to be clean, under names that were supposed to be secure. Someone else knows, she said. Webb looked at the paper in his hand. Someone else has known for a long time. She looked at the 14 lines. She started decoding the string from memory, working through the cipher layer by layer, and the first words that emerged were not a threat, not a warning, not the content of someone who meant them harm. The first words were, "You missed one." She decoded the rest of the string standing at the window with the river outside and the paper in both hands and the particular focused stillness of someone who has trained themselves to work through cipher under pressure without losing the thread. It took 11 minutes. Webb sat on the edge of her bed and did not rush her and did not speak, which was one of the things she had come to depend on without meaning to. His capacity for useful silence, for understanding when the most valuable contribution was to stay out of the way of someone doing something that required their full attention. The message resolved in sections. The first section was the sender identification she didn't recognize, which decoded to an operational designator rather than a name. A unit code that had been active after her rotation, after the dissolution, which meant whoever was using it had been inside the program in its final operational period. The second section was a location, a building address in Portland, 3 miles from the hotel, with a floor number and a room number and a time that was 4 hours from now. The third section was the content. You missed one. Brandt, our deputy director, Federal Procurement Review Board, approved the 2018 contract extension that Harlan needed to protect. Not named in any file you transmitted. Will be promoted to director within 60 days unless stopped. Current location? Active. And then, beneath that, 7 characters that she had to read twice because they didn't fit the pattern of anything else in the message. Trust this. She set the paper down. Webb was watching her. There's a 7th person, she said. Not one of the contracting officials Harlan mentioned. Someone above them. a deputy director on the Federal Procurement Review Board named Brandt. She looked at the address in the second section. And whoever sent this wants to meet. Who sent it? I don't know. The sender designator is from the program's final operational period, after my rotation. She paused. Someone who was inside the signals unit after I left. Could it be Marsh? Marsh doesn't have access to the protocol format. This is a classified structure above her clearance level. She looked at the paper again. This is someone from inside the system. Someone who has been watching this longer than I have, or differently. Trap? She thought about it. She thought about the protocol format, which couldn't be replicated without direct access to a classified archive that required specific clearances to reach. She thought about the cover name, Elaine Voss, which had been secure, which should not have been findable by anyone who wasn't already inside the secure communications chain she and Kelso had been using. She thought about the phrase, "trust this," which was either the most naive thing a sophisticated actor had ever included in an encrypted message, or was itself a specific signal, a reference to something she should recognize. And then she did recognize it. In 2019, during her final debrief, the officer who had conducted her exit interview had said exactly those two words at the end of the last session. Not in any formal context, just as she was standing up and gathering her things, he had said them quietly. Trust this. She had thought at the time that it was an odd thing to say to someone who was leaving, and she had filed it and not returned to it. She didn't know his name. She had never known his name. He had introduced himself only as a debrief coordinator, and she had accepted that because she was tired and because the debrief process didn't require her to know the names of everyone involved. But she knew his voice, and she knew that phrase. It's not a trap, she said. How sure? 90%. He looked at her. What does 10% look like? It looks like we walk into a building and find out we were wrong. She folded the paper and put it in her pocket. But if it's real, and if Brandt is what this says he is, and if he moves to director in 60 days, she stopped. Let the implication finish itself. Then everything we gave Marsh has a ceiling, Webb said. Harlan goes down, the contracting officials face review, but the person who had authority over the whole review board is protected, and eventually uses that protection to manage the investigation scope. He stood. His shoulder was better today. She could see it in how he moved, the left side carrying more weight than it had 2 days ago. 4 hours. 4 hours. They called Marsh first. They didn't send the message or describe the protocol. That would take explanations she wasn't ready to give over a phone line, even a secured one. But Claire told her they had received independent information suggesting a significant gap in the current filing, and that they were following up on it, and that she would have something concrete within 6 hours. Marsh said, "Define following up." Meeting a contact. A pause. "Is this contact known to me?" "No." "Claire, 6 hours. I'll call you." She disconnected before Marsh could continue the argument, because the argument was valid and she didn't have time for it. Webb had changed into clothes that were less hospital adjacent. Earl's house had provided, among other things, a bag of clothing in approximately the right sizes that Claire had not asked about, because Earl was a man with history who understood that prepared people prepared for things. He looked less like a patient now and more like himself, whatever that meant after everything. She was still calibrating it. "I want to go in with you," he said. "I know. Don't tell me I can't." "I wasn't going to." She looked at him. "I was going to say, stay left of me. You favor the right when the shoulder is bothering you, and it makes you readable." He blinked. Then something that was almost a real smile moved across his face. Brief, unguarded, gone, before it fully arrived. "Okay, Beckett." The building was a converted office block near the waterfront, the kind that had been repurposed twice in 20 years and currently housed a mix of small consulting firms and the particular kind of nondescript companies that didn't advertise their function. The room number from the message was on the 4th floor. The elevator worked. The hallway was empty. The door was unlocked. Inside was a single room with no windows, a table, 3 chairs, a laptop open on the table showing a blank document, and a man in his early 60s who was sitting in the chair facing the door with his hands visible on the table in front of him. He was not large. He had the particular colorlessness of someone who had spent a career being unremarkable on purpose. Medium height, Unremarkable clothes, a face that would vanish from memory 30 seconds after you stopped looking at it. Claire recognized his voice before he spoke, because he was already speaking when she pushed the door open. "You're 20 minutes early," he said, "which is what I expected." "Who are you?" Webb said from just inside the door. "My name is Aldous Finch. I spent 17 years in signals intelligence in a program that doesn't appear in any public record. I left that program 14 months ago, which is about 6 months after I discovered what you discovered, only from the inside." He looked at Claire. "I wrote the exit debrief report for your separation from service in 2019. I also told you to trust something on your way out. I wasn't sure you'd remember." "I remembered." "Good." He looked at the laptop. "I've been building a separate file on Brandt for 11 months. Different from your approach. I came from the signals side. You came from the medical access side. We built toward the same point from different directions." He turned the laptop toward them. "Raymond Brandt has been on the Federal Procurement Review Board for 9 years. He approved every major van trade contract renewal during that period. He was also present as a mid-level contracting official in 2018 at a meeting in which the operational parameters of Bravo Element's mission were discussed." Claire looked at the screen. The file was structured differently from hers, denser, more technical, with signal intercept references that she couldn't fully parse without the classified archive access that had produced them. But the shape of it was clear. Brandt wasn't just a downstream beneficiary of what Harlan had done. He had been present at the beginning. He had known about the falsified route order before it was transmitted. "He didn't authorize it," Finch said. "He knew about it, and he didn't stop it, which in federal law is a separate category of criminal liability, but a real one." "Why are you bringing this to us?" Webb said. He was standing with his arms crossed, right over left, protecting the shoulder instinctively, and he was watching Finch with the specific evaluative attention of a man who has been lied to by credentialed people before and has developed a finely calibrated suspicion of people who arrive with answers. "Because I can't submit this file through any official channel I have access to without it being reviewed by someone on Brandt's staff." Finch looked at him steadily. "He's currently deputy director. His office has review authority over federal investigation filings in his sector. Anything I submit goes across his desk." "So submit it to Marsh," Claire said. "Investigator Marsh's filing authority is one level below the threshold required for action against a deputy director. She needs a referral from above her, and the person above her in this specific chain," he paused, "is Brandt's direct superior, who has been Brandt's direct superior for 6 years and who plays golf with him on alternate Saturdays." The room was very quiet. "You need it to come from us," Claire said. "I need it to come from a source that bypasses the internal review structure entirely. A direct submission to the Congressional Oversight Committee through a protected whistleblower channel. Your file from the symposium is already there. Your contact Kelso routed it through the right mechanism. If Finch's Brandt documentation is appended to that existing submission, it arrives in a context that's already been received and verified. It can't be filtered." She looked at the laptop. She thought about Marsh and her carefully worded transparency, about the 7 contracting officials managing their exposure, about the 60-day window before Brandt moved into the directorship that would give him review authority over twice as many channels as he currently had. "How do we know your file is clean?" Webb said. "How do we know you're not Brandt's insurance? That this isn't a controlled operation to find out what we gave to congressional oversight?" It was the right question. She was glad he'd asked it. Finch reached into the bag at his feet and took out a folder. He set it on the table and pushed it toward them. "My personnel file. Unredacted. The version that exists in the classified archive, not the public record. It includes my access history, my reporting chain, my exit documentation, and the internal complaint I filed against Brandt's review process 11 months ago, the complaint that was suppressed by his office within 4 days of submission." She picked up the folder and read. It took 7 minutes. Webb read over her shoulder for the last 3. The complaint was real. The suppression documentation was real. The access history was real in the specific way of things that have been generated by actual systems rather than constructed. The timestamps were inconsistent in the way that real records are inconsistent, with gaps and corrections and the minor administrative chaos of a working bureaucracy, rather than the clean linearity of something fabricated. "Okay," she said. Webb looked at her. "Okay," he said. She called Kelso. "Well, the submission took 4 hours to prepare properly. Finch had the technical infrastructure, a secure transmission system that he had built outside any network Brandt's office touched, using hardware he had removed from the program's decommissioned assets before they were returned to federal inventory, which was either theft or foresight, depending on how things turned out. Claire appended his Brandt file to her existing congressional submission. She wrote a 3-page cover document explaining the connection between the two files, the chain of events from 2018 to the present, and the specific mechanism by which Brandt's advanced knowledge of the falsified root order constituted criminal liability. She wrote it clearly and without rhetoric because rhetoric gave people reasons to question the emotion behind the content, and she wanted the content to stand entirely on its own. Webb gave a supplementary statement about the operational briefing in which the parameters of the mission had been discussed, a briefing that, based on the documentation Finch had provided, Brandt had been present at in a junior capacity. Webb had not known Brandt's name at the time. He had known there was a civilian contracting official in the room. He could describe the room, the meeting, the specific moment when the mission's surveillance scope had been discussed, and the civilian official had said nothing, and in saying nothing had sealed something. She watched Webb record the supplementary statement, and she thought about what it cost him, not the recording itself, but the return to that room, the civilian official in the corner, the 4 men who had walked into an ambush afterward. She watched him be precise and factual, and not allow the grief to perform, and she understood that the precision was not the absence of grief, but the container for it, the only container that produced something useful. The submission went through at 11:47 p.m. Finch confirmed receipt on his end. Kelso confirmed it on his. Then Finch closed the laptop and sat back and looked like a man who had been holding his breath for 11 months and had just exhaled. "What happens to you now?" Claire said. He considered the question as if it were genuinely interesting. "I have a house in New Mexico. I've been thinking about it." "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer I have right now." He looked at her with something that wasn't quite warmth and wasn't quite professional regard, something in between, the look of a person who has watched someone else do something difficult and has registered it accurately. "What you built over 4 years, with the access you had, with no institutional backing, is not a small thing. I want you to know that I know that." She said nothing. She was not sure what to do with it, which was its own kind of information. They left the building at midnight and took a cab back to the hotel because walking was what you did when you had the time and energy for it, and she had neither right now, and neither did Webb, and they both knew it. The Congressional Oversight Committee moved in 9 days, not in the grinding, attritional way of standard federal process, in the compressed, urgent way of a committee that has received a complete documented record of a criminal conspiracy at the deputy director level and understands exactly what it means if they don't act before the 60-day promotion window closes. Brandt was placed on administrative leave pending review on the 8th day. On the 9th day, the review was upgraded to a formal criminal referral. Claire found out from Kelso, who sent a message at 6:14 a.m. that read, "Committee moved. Brandt on leave. Criminal referral filed. You should know this is historic in scope," which was the most emotional language she had ever seen Kelso use, and she read it twice and then sat with it for a moment before she knocked twice on Webb's wall. He knocked back. She slipped the message under the door. They were still in Portland, still in the same hotel, because Marsh had asked them to remain available and they had complied. The hotel had become a strange kind of temporary world, the same breakfast, the same river view, the same hallway. And she had stopped fighting the stillness of it and started using it, which meant she had slept properly for the first time in what felt like years, and had spent 2 days doing nothing more consequential than reading and thinking and watching Webb do his shoulder rehabilitation exercises on the small balcony with the focused, irritated commitment of someone who resents needing to rehabilitate but is doing it anyway. They had talked more in those 9 days than in all the weeks before combined. Not about the case. The case had its own momentum now and didn't need their conversation to sustain it, about the before, his 3 deployments. Her signals work. The specific and unrepeatable texture of being young and capable and certain that the structure you were operating inside was worthy of that capability, and the slower, more complicated education of discovering it wasn't. "I don't regret the service," he said one evening. "I regret what the service was used for. Those aren't the same thing." "No," she said. "Do you regret yours?" She thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about everything. I regret the transmission, she said. Even knowing I couldn't have known. I regret it anyway, because the regret is the appropriate response to the fact that it happened, regardless of what I knew. He nodded. He understood that. She had suspected he would. Garrison had a daughter, he said. She was 3 when he died. She's 7 now. I know. He looked at her. You know? I looked it up, a year ago. She paused. I didn't do anything with it. I didn't know what I could do. Maybe there's something now. She thought about that. She thought about what something now meant for 2 people who had been living in the operational mode, the mode of movement and threat and the next decision, and were slowly, uncertainly, learning to inhabit a different mode, the mode where time moved forward instead of laterally, where planning could extend beyond the next 8 days, where the question, what do you do when this is over, had to be answered instead of deferred. Maybe, she said. Investigator Marsh requested their presence in a federal building in Portland on the 14th day after the symposium. The meeting room was not the borrowed conference room from a commandeered event. It was a proper federal space, with the specific institutional weight of official process, and there were more people in it than Claire had expected. Marsh was there. Kelso, whom Claire had never met in person, was a small man in his late 40s with the particular physical stillness of someone who had spent a career being the person in the room who said least and heard most. 2 members of the Congressional Oversight Committee staffers were present, and a woman from the Inspector General's office who said almost nothing throughout the meeting and whose silence carried more authority than anyone else's speech. They went through the case in formal terms. The charges against Harlan, which now numbered 7 counts, the original 2 expanded as investigators worked through the Vantrade financial records and found evidence of procurement fraud that predated the 2018 ambush by 3 years. The criminal referral against Brandt, which was proceeding and which had already expanded to include 2 members of his staff who had been involved in suppressing Finch's internal complaint. The federal holds on all Vantrade Solutions contracts, totaling over $4 billion in suspended federal procurement. The status of the 7 contracting officials, 3 of whom had by now retained attorneys and 1 of whom had entered preliminary cooperation discussions with federal investigators. The IG's office representative, whose name was Faulkner, spoke once. The 2018 events, she said, the Bravo element ambush, it's going to take a separate formal inquiry to fully adjudicate. The criminal referrals cover the active conspiracy elements. The historical record, the falsified route order, the deaths, those require a different process. How different? Webb said. Longer, but it opens. The Congressional Committee has already asked for a classified review of all operations in that region during that period. Faulkner looked at Webb with the direct, unornamented attention of someone who has reviewed a lot of documents about a person and is now seeing them for the first time as a human being rather than a file. Your record will be part of that review. The medical separation, the VA designation, those will be reconsidered under the new evidentiary context. Webb said nothing for a moment. And my men. The formal record of their deaths will be reviewed. The inquiry has authority to reclassify cause of mission failure. The room was quiet. Claire watched Webb receive that, watched the careful stillness of his face, the slight movement of his jaw, the thing that he did when something significant arrived and he needed a moment to keep it from showing too much. She looked away, not because she didn't want to see it, but because it was his, and it deserved privacy even in a room full of people. After the formal part of the meeting, Marsh walked with them to the building's exit. The nursing conduct review at Harwick Memorial concluded 2 days ago, she said. The complaints against you were dismissed. The pharmacy flagging you initiated on Webb's medication order has been incorporated into the hospital's incident report, and the report characterizes your intervention as clinically sound. She paused. Dr. Alderman's credential review is ongoing. That's a separate process, and I can't speak to its outcome. But the medical board has the full context of what occurred. And Rosalind Marsh, Claire said. She had not thought about Rosalind until now, the charge nurse who had tried to stop her from entering Bay 7, who had been in the office when Alderman issued the formal warning, who had also been the woman watching through the small window in the door on the night everything started. Marsh, Investigator Marsh, looked slightly surprised. She filed a supporting statement for your conduct review. Voluntary. Said the nursing intervention in Bay 7 on the night in question demonstrated clinical judgment that prevented patient harm. A brief pause. She also said, and I'm quoting, that she thought you were reckless, and she'd tell you that herself. Claire absorbed that. Something in the architecture of the last 4 weeks shifted slightly. A small realignment, not dramatic, just the adjustment of realizing that the people who had seemed to be obstacles were sometimes more complicated than obstacles, were sometimes people doing the best they could inside systems that hadn't given them enough information. She had not always been generous about that. She filed it. 3 weeks later, Harlan's first appearance in federal court drew 4 journalists, which was not the packed gallery moment that public corruption narratives produced in film and television. The real version was quieter and more procedural, a courtroom with fluorescent lighting and the particular smell of institutional carpet, a judge who moved through the hearing efficiently, a defendant whose attorney made measured arguments that bought time and changed nothing about the trajectory. Harlan himself sat with the contained, effortful composure of a man who understood that composure was the only remaining asset and was spending it carefully. Claire was not in the courtroom. She was not a named party at this stage. Her role was witness, and witnesses didn't attend proceedings where their testimony would be material. She found out about the hearing from Kelso, who attended and sent a summary in his characteristic telegraphic style. Held for trial. Bail denied. Counsel made noise. Got nothing. Brandt's attorney was in the gallery watching. That last line was interesting. She thought about it for a day and concluded it meant Brandt's legal team was monitoring Harlan's proceedings to understand how much of the evidence chain was going to bear on their own case, which was rational, which also meant they were worried, and worried defendants with attorneys made calculation errors that tended to produce more evidence. She had begun working again. Not at Harwick Memorial. That chapter had its own particular ending, and she had no interest in reopening it. She had applied for the position at a community health clinic in a mid-sized city 40 miles east of Portland, the kind of clinic that served people who didn't have other options: logging families, agricultural workers, veterans who had fallen through the gaps of the VA system. The interview had been a conversation with a medical director named Souza, who had spent 20 years in emergency medicine and who had, in the course of the interview, asked her twice whether she understood that the position would require a lot of autonomy and a lot of working with limited resources in circumstances that were not always orderly. She had said yes both times. She started the following Monday. The first week was orientation mostly, with 3 days of patient contact that were their own kind of recalibration. The return to the body's ordinary rhythms, the specific focus of another person's distress, the work of being present to someone's immediate need without any of the operational overlay that had been running as background noise in her nervous system for 4 years. It was harder than she'd expected and better than she'd expected, and she went home the first Friday night with her feet hurting and her hands smelling of antiseptic, and a feeling she hadn't had in long enough that it took her 2 days to identify it. She was okay. Not resolved, not completed, not the clean-ending version of okay that existed in stories that moved faster than life, but okay in the way that meant the weight was distributed differently now, held by a structure that was more than one person's private architecture, held by process, by record, by the specific gravity of documented truth. Webb had moved to a transitional housing program in Portland, a legitimate one, through a veterans organization that Marsh had connected him to, in a building with other people who were navigating the particular geography of a life after service. He was not entirely comfortable there. He was not entirely comfortable anywhere, which she suspected had been true before the ambush and was simply more visible now. He had started working with the veterans organization in a peer support capacity, which he had not volunteered for and which had been suggested to him by the program coordinator with the particular gentle firmness of someone who recognizes that the most useful thing a person can do with their experience is let it be useful to someone else. He had told her about it over the phone. They talked on Thursdays, which was not a scheduled thing. It had simply become the day when one of them called, with the slightly defensive tone of someone who has done something that matters and doesn't want to make a performance of the fact that it matters. "It's 2 hours a week," he said. "I know. I'm not going to be some kind of, I don't know, I'm not good at the talking part." "Webb." She was at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee. "You're the best person I've ever met at saying the necessary thing without saying anything extra. That's exactly what peer support requires." A pause. "You think so?" "Yes." "Okay." Another pause. The inquiry opened. She set down the coffee. When? Yesterday. Kelso called. The Congressional Classified Review. It formally opened. The Bravo Element operation is in scope. They want statements from the surviving members. He was quiet for a moment. Rios called me last week. First time we've talked in 3 years. How is he? Complicated, same as the rest of us. A brief pause. He said he wants to give a statement. Taggart too. She changed her mind. She thought about that. 3 people who had survived something designed to kill them, who had spent years carrying it without knowing what they were carrying, who would now sit in formal settings and describe what had happened to investigators with recording equipment and legal authority. It would not be clean. It would not resolve in a single session or a single document, but it would be on record, and the record was what outlasted everything else. The record was what prevented the next version. It's going to be hard, she said. Yeah. You'll do it anyway. Yeah. His voice was steady, the same steadiness she had read as distance in the first weeks, that she now read as what it actually was, a form of determination that had learned to be quiet about itself because the loud version hadn't survived everything it had been through. So will you? She looked at the window. The evening light outside was the particular gold of early autumn, the kind that came in low and made ordinary things, the parked cars, the neighbor's garden, the unremarkable street, look briefly like they were being seen clearly for the first time. Yes, she said. The formal commendation came 6 months after the symposium, in a document that was classified and therefore unpublicized, which was the only version of recognition that fit a case built entirely from classified materials. It named her contribution to the investigation in terms that were careful and specific and did not use words like heroic, which she preferred, because heroic was the word people used when they wanted to contain something in a category that explained it and moved on. What she had done did not reduce to a category. She had been a communications officer who transmitted an order that killed 4 men, not through malice, but through the vulnerability that everyone who works inside a trusted system carries, the assumption that the system deserves the trust. She had spent 4 years living with that, learning from it, converting it from something that paralyzed her into something that moved. She had built a shadow infrastructure from a nursing license and a storage unit and a contact list of 3 people, and she had used it to get close enough to the truth to pull it into the light where it couldn't be managed back into darkness. She had not done it perfectly. She had made decisions that a more cautious person would not have made, and some of them had worked and some had nearly not worked. And the ones that had nearly not worked were the ones she would think about at 3 a.m. for the rest of her life, which was not a punishment, but was the correct cognitive tax on having made consequential choices under incomplete information. What she had also done, in the middle of all of it, was be a nurse, had adjusted medication schedules and redressed wounds and found podcasts about long-distance shooting and sat in the dark beside a man who was fighting a war nobody could see and had known what he needed because she had learned to pay attention to what people actually were rather than what they appeared to be in the context of a system that had already decided what they were. That part was not in the commendation. It didn't need to be. It was the part she carried herself. She was at the clinic on a Wednesday afternoon when her phone showed a message from Webb. No text, just a photograph. She opened it and looked at it for a long moment. It was a piece of paper, a formal document, military letterhead, official seal. The language was dense and bureaucratic, but the substance was clear. The congressional inquiry had concluded its preliminary review of the Bravo Element operation. The mission had been reclassified. The cause of the ambush had been formally attributed to criminal interference in military communications. The 4 men who had died were to be recognized in the official record as having been killed as a direct result of that interference, not as a result of operational failure or compromised local intelligence. 4 names. The formal record, corrected. Garrison. Pollack. The Reyes brothers. She sat with her phone in her hand for a moment in the break room of a community health clinic, with the sounds of the ordinary working day continuing around her. Someone on the phone at the front desk, the automatic door opening and closing, the particular steady hum of a place where people came for help and received it and went back to their lives. Then she typed back, "Good." It was not adequate. She knew it wasn't adequate. But sometimes the thing that was true was also the thing that was small. And she had learned that the small true thing was worth more than the large performed thing, and she sent it, and she went back to work. Because that was what you did. You held the weight of what had happened, and you let it change you in the ways that were useful, and you showed up the next day to the thing that was in front of you, and you did it as well as you could with the specific and imperfect tools you had. She had been dismissed. She had been documented as a problem, a liability, a transfer nurse with a thin file and a habit of making decisions above her station. She had been warned and reviewed and threatened with termination for doing the thing that was obviously right in a context where obviously right was not the path of least resistance for anyone around her. None of that had stopped her. Not because she was extraordinary. She was not, or not in the way the word usually meant, not without fear or error or the grinding uncertainty that accompanied every decision she'd made in the last 4 years. But because she had learned something that the system she'd operated in had never managed to teach, which was that the person who sees what is actually happening has an obligation to that seeing. Not a comfortable obligation, not an obligation that arrives with institutional support or a clear chain of command or any guarantee that it leads somewhere good. Just an obligation. She had carried it. She still carried it. She would carry it again. The door opened, and a man in his early 70s came in with a hand pressed to his ribs and the look of someone who had driven himself to a clinic instead of calling an ambulance because he didn't want to make a fuss. And Claire Donovan put her phone in her pocket and crossed the room to meet him, and the work continued.